Hello, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Corey. I'm the founder of BeatingTrauma.com, and I'm here today to talk to you about the impact of trauma on our lives. Today, I want to spend a bit of time talking to you about relationship, which is probably one of the most complicated things we deal with as a kind of in the aftermath of complex trauma, because the truth is that complex trauma is almost always relational in nature. As a matter of fact, I struggle to see how complex trauma would not be relational in nature in some way. So that is going to impact our relationships in a pretty significant way. And, especially probably most of all, our intimate relationships, which I sometimes refer to as like the Mount Everest of this work that we're doing, this recovery work. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about relationships because honestly, it's one of the most loaded topics out there, and you're going to hear about as many opinions as there are people out there giving them when it comes to what to do about relationships after complex trauma. There are so many opinions about this topic, and honestly, for the most part, the opinions about relationships are gonna have an air of projection to them. And by this, I mean people who are out there coaching, healing, helping, whatever they're doing, even therapy, even those therapists out there, there's going to be a level of projection about how their own beliefs are driving their kind of opinions based on their traumas and what they've been told. So we have to remember that ultimately relationships need to be driven by your own internal system and what I like to refer to as the internal guidance system. The problem is our internal guidance systems are often broken, right? And by broken, I don't mean in a kind of permanent way. Generally speaking, we're just not in touch with that anymore. And that's one of the reasons relationships can be so tricky. Not just in the decisions we make around relationships and what to do with them, but also in general, kind of knowing what's healing and what's not, right? So I want to talk a little bit about this today and give you some of my thoughts and my ideas. Again, is there a level of projection in what I'm telling you? Possibly. Yeah, but I'm also super aware around projection, and we're even going to talk more about that today when it comes to relationships because it plays into them and it plays into the level of safety that you have around them. Okay, so I want to throw that out there too. So let's talk a little bit about this. So one of the most common phrases I think we hear when it comes to relationships after trauma is that you have to love yourself in order to be loved. And I will tell you that this concept gets some really intense responses from people. I mean, really intense. I mean, to the point where it can even bring up like a tremendous amount of anger in people who just do not like the way this puts the focus on the self-healing piece of the journey. And honestly, most of us have spent our entire childhoods hoping that somebody was going to come along and heal us and help us and save us and be that person that finally would make us feel okay, right? And so then we get into adulthood and we hear these things like, well, you have to love yourself first so that people will love you the way that you need to be loved. And that feels incredibly unfair. And honestly, the truth of it is that it is unfair. It is unfair to go through a childhood of trauma and abuse and horrible treatment and then turn around and have to heal all, or you can have some kind of reasonable relationship. And the truth is that while, yes, there is some truth to those statements, it's also not so black and white. It's not that we're going to flip a switch on or off. We're either going to love ourselves or we're not. We're either going to get in good relationships or we're not. That's not how it works. It is much, much more on a spectrum. And I think it helps us to know that. Now, a lot of you may already know that I come at the concept of isolation from a different perspective than a lot of people do, especially people who are coaching and healing. I actually do think there is a place for isolation in this work, not re-traumatizing isolation. Okay. I'm not necessarily talking about that. I also know that isolation can often be used as a part of our trauma. Like it's a form of abuse, especially when we're little. So we have to keep those things in mind. But the problem is that in order to come back to ourselves after a lifetime of people pleasing, we are going to need to remove the din of external opinions from all around us so that we can reconnect with that internal guidance system because we're disconnected from it. So that's what I was talking about at the beginning. The internal guidance system is broken, but not really. It's just we can't hear it, right? And we can't hear it because everybody around us is saying, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. And we're still in that mode where we're like, oh yeah, I got to do what they say before I do what I want to do, right? So that isolation, that time away from significant relationships, so not talking about surfacey stuff, but significant relationships is a part of finding our voice all over again. And I do believe wholeheartedly in isolation as a part of our healing. I will say that it feels yucky because when we're in isolation, up comes that love seeker, desperate for somebody to come in and save them, right? The real reason for that is because they need to grieve. They need to feel heard by self, but they really, really, really want to find somebody to fix it for them. And when we step out of relationship, the first thing we may feel is really lost, really lonely, really isolated, and not okay. It is that feeling, it is sitting with that not okay feeling, right, that actually heals us in a way that does make relationships better for us in the long term. But honestly, nobody wants to hear what I just said. I don't even want to hear what I just said, but I know it's true. I do know that's true. I've seen it work in myself and many, many other people, right? So I do need to start off by just talking about that isolation and the key and the importance of it because it is a critical component of our healing. That said, there are a lot of people out there talking about healing in relationship, right? And Caroline's saying, I'm in this place now. Yeah. And I know this place and I've been in and out of it a lot in my own recovery. Not that I can be totally isolated. I do have 2 children. So there is some level to where I am not isolated. But again, isolation isn't necessarily about strict and total isolation, but it is about not following that love seeker into, kind of really codependent, enmeshed, boundaryless relationships that are not going to do what we're hoping. And that's really what I want to talk about next, is this idea of healing in relationship, right? That's the theory. And it's really, really good in theory, right? Like, I mean, many relationships that we form can really help to show us our triggers, show us the things that we really want to work on within ourselves, show us what the patterns are that have not healed yet. They definitely put us in touch with parts. There's no doubt about that. That's all really good. However, there can be relationships that actually are not helpful in our healing journey. These are relationships that bring us back to our trauma cycles, so much so that we begin to dissociate, that we stop our healing really in its tracks, and we end up re-traumatized instead. These are not good relationships for our healing. And there are certain types of relationships where we shouldn't subscribe to that idea that all healing happens in relationship, because it doesn't. Sometimes healing happens specifically from protecting ourselves from these kind of relationships. And unfortunately, when you have like significant complex trauma, which again is interpersonal in nature, You are not always going to bring the best people into your space. Not because you're making bad decisions. We're not here to like blame this on, the people who suffered from the trauma. But what we do have to recognize is there can be an energetic attraction to people that are a little too similar to our past abusers, and we don't even see it happening. It can be a very, very unconscious attraction. So we have to recognize that that's there. I can tell you every time, before I really, really kicked into this deep work that I'm doing now here, every person I brought into my space, at first they looked really different. I thought they were. I thought, no, this time I've chosen correctly. Unfortunately, the pattern continued, and sometimes it felt like it was getting worse with each one. So let's step back. Okay, so you can't necessarily do anything about what you're energetically attracting in the moment, but what you can do is start practicing some of these kind of key things I'm going to talk about today in your relationships, and building your awareness consistently in those relationships about what is happening around you. This is where awareness is our friend. And I will be honest, if you start to see patterns that look like your childhood abuse, even subtle ones, because remember, people test to see where they could go. You want to step back, right? So, because when we start getting into abuse patterns, we are no longer healing in that relationship. We are dissociating, we are re-traumatizing ourselves, and we are being re-traumatized. Okay, so that's not for us. But let's talk about some signs that your relationships actually could be providing some healing for you. Okay, and again, I'm talking about intimate relationships here, but I'm also talking about friendships. And at the very end, I'm going to give you a helper one too, because I think those are very, very important in this journey too, because there are helper relationships that can re-traumatize us. It happens. Okay. So we need to know about those too. The first one is relationships that are slow and steady with lots of time away. Now, what I just said is not a love seeker relationship. That is not how love seekers work. They meet somebody and they're like, I want to move in. I want to get married. Like, I want to define the rest of my life around this person. Those are not going to be your healing relationships. Those are going to be your re-traumatizing relationships. So if your relationship is slow and steady, right? With lots of time to yourself in between meetings with this person, okay, that's a really good sign. If you can both maintain that on some level, that's really good. That's what we want, because that time in between, we need it to kind of evaluate where we're at. A lot of times, because we're disconnected from that internal guidance system, we don't necessarily know whether or not something is working for us, or whether or not we were triggered by somebody, until we sit with it for a while. And if we're constantly with that person and constantly doing things with them, we don't really have a chance to process and connect with ourselves and figure out, is this really okay for me? Or am I just sort of following wherever this person is going? We want to know that. And the only way to know that is to give ourselves that time in between relating to that other person. The next one I have for you, and this is in the early days. A lot of what I'm talking about is in the early days, but of course we can extrapolate it out into further into relationships too. So in the early days, is there two distinct lives with boundaries happening? Okay. We want to fight that urge to mesh those lives together. Again, this is a kind of a love seeker thing to do. We want to look and go, okay, is there separate living arrangements? Are there separate vacations going on? Are there separate activities happening? Are there other friends or other people that you're in contact with that don't know this person? Or maybe they know them, but they're not super close to that person, right? We want to make sure that we're living two distinct lives. There is nothing wrong with any kind of relationship, intimate or not, where two people have their own lives but come together when they can, right? That's actually really good for us. Again, I know all of your love seekers might be screaming and yelling right now. Your isolators are probably going, yeah, right. Your love seekers are probably yelling right now that this is not okay. And of course, the focus outside of relationship needs to be on continuing to sit with the desperation in that love seeker, sit with that loneliness, help them to heal. Because aloneness is an adult feeling. And that's one of those feelings where we're like, yeah, I've been alone a lot. Maybe I should like go out and, hang out with some people and do some things or go to a yoga class or, visit with a group of people, whatever it may be. Loneliness is the love seeker desperation. So that's aloneness plus desperation equals loneliness, if you like formulas. That's what's happening. So when we feel that loneliness, that's when we know we need to hear from our love seeker. That's when writing and grieving and even anger are great things. Okay. So we want to keep engaging with the love seeker through this process because they will be continuously trying to push us into an enmeshment, which will often lead to some kind of re-traumatization. My next sign that a relationship can be healing is that both people are making decisions, right? If there is pressure for you to change who you are, change even what you look like, change what you do for a living, anything where you feel a lot of pressure to do something that is different from the decisions you've made in your life without that person, and you feel like they're right decisions. I'm not talking about somebody encouraging you to make a change that you want to make. That's not the same thing. It's when that pressure comes in. And it can be simple things like, you should cut your hair, or, you'd be great. Maybe you should go back to school and be this other thing because you'd be really great at that. But you haven't really expressed any interest in doing those things, right? Like we want to look for these suggestions that seem to come out of nowhere. And especially if they're made many, many times, right? Like you start looking at it and going, I'm feeling pressure around this thing. That's not a good thing for us. We want to look at things like that. Now, most of these things I'm talking about, like boundaries and pushing us to, lack of boundaries and pushing us to make decisions that they like, these are things that we have often been trained to accept in our relationships. So while when I describe it, you might be thinking, well, yeah, I mean, I know that's bad. When we get in the relationship, it can be very difficult to see it. Really difficult because we have our blinders on because these are things we experienced as children. And so the blinders are on because one of the strategies we had to use as children was to tell ourselves things weren't happening when they were. And this is it's a survival skill. It's how we make it through complex trauma. But we keep doing that in adulthood. So it can be really hard to see some of these things. This is part of the problem, right? So my next one is both people are allowed to have opinions even when those opinions are different. Sometimes I like to tell people, make sure to express a differing opinion from the person that you're in this relationship with, early on in the relationship, right? Because early on in the relationship is sometimes when we try to be the most pleasing, we may even love bomb a little bit. We have to kind of look out for stuff like that because we really, really, really want this person to like us. We really want them to stick around. And so we may kind of do a little more pleasing than normal. But unfortunately, what happens there then is that we don't have the opportunity to see how this person deals with differing opinions. Because honestly, a lot of people can be really, really nice when they're always getting their way. It's just the truth, right? But when we come out and say, you know what? I would rather do this instead of this, or I really believe in this and not this. And the other person starts to behave in a way that feels maybe a bit aggressive or a bit passive aggressive or whatever it may be, a covert narc, right? Like those kind of concepts. If they, if they're really nice until we say, hey, you know what? Not sure that's how I see it. It is better to know that early. Even though your love seeker will be saying, no, 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 please, 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 just please them as long as you can. That actually is kind of not great for us because we'll continue to get attached, but we won't know the whole story. So, and part of this is about us being authentic, right? Like, we're not being authentic if we're in pleasing mode, and we're not allowing them the opportunity to give us their authentic response because we're in pleasing mode. They're getting everything they want. It's not an authentic situation, right? And you can't really heal in that, right? So the next one, is there any hinting at all of responsibility for the life of the other? So what I mean by this is, does it feel in the relationship like you keep having to take responsibility for the situation of the other person, for the emotional state of the other person, for just almost anything? Does it feel like you're being blamed for the other person's life and the way they're living it and the way they feel about it? These are really things to look out for because it's a big pattern for us with complex trauma, if I'm honest. Most of the time, we were made to feel like we needed to be responsible for one of our parents or both of them in some way. This, can be a really, really common way of creating a codependence in a child. It's like, I feel sad and it's your fault. My life is a mess and I'm trapped and it's your fault. I mean, the truth is, yeah, kids do kind of trap us. I mean, to a degree, we do have to make very different decisions when we become parents than we did when we were single. However, that is not something we want to be continuously communicating to our children. We don't want to be communicating that at all. The child did not choose to be here, right? That was on us. So, well, whoever the parent is. I say us because I have kids. And so I need to remind my parts of that sometimes. Like, they didn't ask to be here. I brought them here. And so now the changes in my life are my responsibility, but many parents, abusive parents, parents with a lot of codependence going on, parents with enmeshment with their children will be like, my life is completely due to your existence and I don't like it, right? Like, so we want to watch for those patterns in our adult relationships because they can't show up there. Like, oh, you made me do this thing and now I'm miserable, or, that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that there are some times when you said something and it's made the other person feel a certain way and they want to talk about that. That's not what I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about your existence is affecting my life and it's making me a certain way. That's your fault, right? That's what I'm talking about here, right? Some of these things can be subtle and they can be really hard for us with all this trauma to kind of differentiate sometimes. This is stuff I've learned over a pretty long period of time and a lot of healing. It's not easy to differentiate some of this. It really isn't. So the next one, if you've established habits that you really love before the relationship, are you still doing those things? Okay. This was a big one for me that I totally only saw in hindsight. But before I met the children's father, I was actually doing some pretty awesome things for myself. I had established some really cool patterns, and habits that I was pretty proud of. And I look back on them and I'm like, wow, I was still pretty young and I was starting to connect with myself in a pretty deep way. And I was doing lots of really good things for myself. And I had my own independent living space. And it was actually pretty impressive. I mean, I was barely 30, living a good life. And it is amazing how fast when he showed up in my life, all of those really amazing habits just kind of came crashing to the ground. And when I look back on it, I realized he was kind of guilting me about doing things for myself. And I just fell for it. I just fell for it. So watch for those habits. You want to keep those habits in place. If you're doing things for yourself, you need to keep doing things for yourself. As soon as you start to feel pressure to not do those things for yourself, you need to start questioning what's happening in the relationship, right? If it is an intimate relationship, was there alone time before you met? So this could be a pretty big red flag when we jump from one intimate relationship directly to the next intimate relationship into the next. We're not giving ourselves an opportunity to heal and connect with ourselves in between those relationships to heal the patterns that we just saw in that relationship. And as I said at the beginning, there's gonna be an energetic pull to certain types of people. So even if we think, oh yeah, I know exactly what was going on there and I'm not gonna recreate it, it really doesn't matter what we think consciously, we're going to recreate it and we'll see it later. Okay. And sometimes only in hindsight. So we want to make sure we're giving us that space between relationships to look at those patterns and heal what's going on emotionally within us so that we can bring somebody in who has a different pattern that, we can really embrace. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is with helpers. Helpers can bring a lot of healing to us. I mean, obviously, I'm speaking as a helper, so that needs to be taken into consideration here. But what we want to be asking ourselves in helper relationships to really understand if they're healing is, one, are there boundaries? Okay. Helpers are not our besties. Love seekers want them to be our besties or our parents or whatever, but we actually don't want that. We want significant boundaries in those helper relationships. We don't need to know everything going on in the helper's life. At the same time, I think personally, it can be very helpful for helpers to share when there are things that they can relate to, because it helps us to feel not alone, within reason, of course. We don't want the helper talking about themselves the whole time we're in our session with them. And I have heard of helpers doing that. So we don't want that. But a little bit of, I can relate to that because I experienced something similar, is fantastic. We want those boundaries in place, right? We definitely need those. And then the other one is the helper needs to be doing enough of their own healing that they have a pretty deep awareness of possible projection. Because when we are giving advice to our clients, and I'm speaking as a helper here, it is very easy to give the advice we're giving ourselves inside. Sometimes that still may have a trauma recovery element for ourselves in there. So I find it very helpful in my work to actually tell the other person, this is hitting close to home for me. This is something I'm familiar with in my own life. So I'm just going to state that from a projection standpoint, but this is something I think might help. That's important. If you have a helper who is absolutely adamant that the only way to do something is to do it the way they're telling you, there's a likelihood of projection playing out there. So watch for that, right? That's important. That's why when people come to me, say, do you recommend somebody like a therapist, because they need to make sure insurance is going to cover it or what have you. I can't give recommendations for therapists because most of, I don't know them, but what I always say is make sure that they're doing their own work. I don't care how healed that therapist thinks they are. Make sure you find someone who is working on themselves, because none of us are totally healed. That's just not a thing. That's just not a thing. So that's my Southern coming out. That is not a thing. So that's what I have for you guys today. Thank you so much. Thank you, Carol. And I really look forward to talking to you guys next week, same time, same place, on another great trauma topic. And hey, you guys can also message me anytime. If you're like, hey, I have a topic for you. I would love for you to talk about this. Please just let me know what it is. I am glad to take requests in this work. Just send me a message. And I look forward to talking to you guys next week. Bye.